Welcome to another episode of the House of Bronte. In today's episode, we're going to look at a joyous occasion in the Bronte story. We're going to look at a remarkable first-person account of the wedding of Charlotte Bronte. Hi, I'm Nick Holland. I'm a Bronte biographer, Bronte fan. I also run the weekly Bronte blog, ambronte.org, so check that out if you don't already. And you can follow me on Twitter at Nick_Holland_. Yeah, somebody else has got Nick Holland and they don't use it, but never mind, Nick_Holland_. Now, I love the Brontes. I keep bringing you Bronte videos here on the House of Bronte, and often they're rather sad tales, rather sad episodes that I'm talking about. On my subscription page at the end of the videos, if you haven't subscribed, please do. On the page it says the House of Bronte, torment, triumph and tragedy. There's a lot of torment, there's a lot of tragedy in the Bronte sisters' story. But today we're looking at a triumph moment. It was the moment that Charlotte Bronte got married. There was tragedy to follow. We're not going to go into that today. We'll concentrate on the triumph, because it was around this time of the year, in the year 1854. In fact, it was 29th of June 1854 in Haworth. Charlotte Bronte married her father's assistant curate, a man called Arthur Bell Nicholls. Now, their courtship hadn't been an easy one. Arthur had worked for Patrick Bronte, Charlotte's father, for many years as assistant curate in Haworth Church, and he'd long loved Charlotte Bronte. Long before her work had appeared in print, he'd admired her, he'd loved her, and eventually he told Charlotte what he felt about her. He went to see her father and said, I want to marry your daughter. And Patrick Bronte was absolutely furious, because by this time Charlotte had become a published author. She was making her own money. She got a successful life seemingly ahead of her. Patrick thought it was very above his station, really. That's really what it was, that Arthur should dare to propose to his daughter Charlotte Bronte. So Patrick was absolutely furious, and then Arthur made his way into the different room, to the living room, the dining room if you like, to see Charlotte herself. And Charlotte wrote a letter saying, it made me realise for the first time what it costs a man, to make his emotions, his intentions known when he isn't sure of the answer. And Charlotte's answer was no, I don't want to marry you. So Arthur was absolutely crestfallen. He left the room and began making plans to leave Haworth. In fact, he applied to become a missionary in Australia. Here in 2025, we can't imagine missionaries being needed in Australia. But back then, Church of England missionaries were going out there. So what happened next? Well, Arthur did leave Haworth. And Charlotte again gives an account, or moving account really, of his last services, Arthur's service at Haworth Church. By this time Patrick was old and wasn't really up to doing services himself very often, so Arthur was doing most of the church work. It said at one of his final services he just stood in the pulpit, tried to speak, he couldn't speak, he just stood there shaking, and in the end two of the churchmen had to lead him down from the pulpit and walk him out of the church, and the women were weeping in the church. And I think that's very moving, really. That just shows what Arthur felt about Charlotte. And he thought he was leaving, never to see her again. But he didn't go to Australia. He stayed in Haworth. He didn't stay in Haworth, he stayed in Yorkshire. Went to a friend's parish to help out there, near Pontefract. And he kept writing to Charlotte. And eventually, Charlotte began to see another side to him. And they arranged to meet up again in 1854. He proposed again, and Charlotte accepted. So it was a happy ending for Arthur and for Charlotte. She wasn't sure even though she'd known Arthur for many years, she wasn't sure of his character. She said, "Oh, he's not into poetry, he's not into books." But she began to realise how steadfast he was, how true and loyal he was, and these were qualities that Charlotte admired. And how a parishioners writing after the event about the couple, the happy couple, said they made a strange physical couple. Charlotte was very small, very frail. Arthur, for the time, was very big. He was an Irishman, like Charlotte's father. So he was a very big, bulky, bluff Irish man, but a very intelligent man as well. He'd gone to university and qualified to be a priest. But they made physically a rather little and large combination. But let's fast forward then to 29th of June 1854, and they're due to get married. They've arranged the wedding in Haworth Church for 8 a.m. An early start for them all. Because 8 a.m. was, and it still is, the earliest time that couples can legally marry in the Church of England. So what happened at 8 a.m? Well, we know because we've got a remarkable account has survived from 1913. Just think 1913, the world, England and the world is on the brink of World War I. And it's incredible. A man living then, he was talking to his local newspaper in South Yorkshire, a man called John Robinson, on the brink of World War, and what's he remembering? Charlotte Bronte and Arthur Bell Nicholls. All that time later, but he not only remembers it, he was there at the wedding. He was one of only 9 people, in fact, who was at the wedding in Haworth. In 1913, he was a retired schoolmaster in Wombwell, near Barnsley, but he remembered it well, and he spoke to his local newspaper and gave this incredible account of the wedding of Arthur Bell Nicholls and Charlotte Bronte. By the time John Robinson gave his interview in 1913, he was a retired head teacher living on the outskirts of Barnsley. But in 1854, he was a boy or teenager from Haworth, and he was being taught how to be a teacher. He was an apprentice teacher. The person teaching him was Arthur Bell Nicholls, who, as well as being village assistant curate, was also in charge of a village Church of England school that had been founded by Patrick Bronte. And he used to teach for children alongside Charlotte Bronte for a long time. So John Robinson knew Arthur Bell Nicholls, and he gave him a glowing account. So I'm just looking down, by the way, because I've got my laptop down here, which has got my blog post with the quote that I wanted to read out. So let's have a look. Here we are. He said about Arthur Bell Nicholls, John Robinson said, "I never saw a man feel more than he did. No kinder-hearted man, or one more anxious to see others improve their position in life, ever lived. And I myself, I might say scores besides, have him to thank for putting us in the way to making a way in life, instead of remaining where we had been born, which was one of the poorest places in England." So Robinson really saying Arthur Bell Nicholls was a great man, he was a great teacher, and he changed his life completely. And that's true, and so it shows a good side to Arthur's character. I think that's one of the things that eventually won Charlotte around. But then Robinson, in his account, went on to the wedding day itself, and it's not what you might imagine for a wedding day of Charlotte Bronte, this great writer. So here is the account. They, Charlotte and Arthur, they were married during my apprenticeship. It was not known in the neighbourhood that the marriage was coming off, and to my surprise, when going past the end of Church Fields to my lesson one morning, old John Brown, the sexton, was waiting for me, and he said, "We want that to go to Top of Till to watch for 3 parsons coming from Totherhill, coming from Oxenhope. Charlotte and Mr. Nicholls are going to be married, and when thou sees Mr. Nicholls, Mr. Grant and Mr. Sowden coming at Far Hill, thou must get back to parsonage, so Charlotte and Ellen Nussey can get their things on and go down to church." So that's quoting him directly. Obviously, gone into the Yorkshire there, the Haworth dialect used by John Brown, who was a sexton, lived next door to the Brontes. His daughter Martha Brown was a long time parsonage servant, and John had been best friends with Branwell Bronte. So John Brown knew the Brontes very well. He knew Arthur Bell Nicholls very well, and he talked in a Yorkshire accent. So what he's saying, if you didn't understand that Yorkshire, he's saying Charlotte and Arthur are getting married. They're going to watch for 3 parsons coming from the other hill. They're going to be Mr. Nicholls, Mr. Grant and Mr. Sowden. Now Mr. Nicholls was a bridegroom, Mr. Grant was another curate, another priest. He was his best man. Mr. Sowden, Reverend Sutcliffe Sowden, another friend who was going to perform the wedding ceremony. So they'd all been staying together in Oxenhope, a nearby village. And they were going to walk from Oxenhope early in the morning over the hill. And when John Robinson, who was then a young boy with his good eyesight, saw these 3 figures approaching over the hill, that's when he knew he had to run back to the parsonage and get Charlotte Bronte and Ellen Nussey, who were getting ready in the parsonage for the wedding. Ellen was the chief bridesmaid. There was one other person there, which wasn't mentioned by John Robinson, but we know she was there from other accounts and from a wedding register. Margaret Wooler, who was Charlotte's, first of all, her teacher, and then her employer, and then became a friend. And she gave Charlotte away. Patrick Bronte, whether he was too ill or whether he still didn't fully approve of Arthur, he made his excuses and said he couldn't come to a wedding, couldn't make a short distance between the parsonage and the church. But by this time, Patrick was an elderly man. He was blind in effect, so it's very possible that he wasn't well enough to attend the service himself. So Margaret Wooler stepped into that role and gave Charlotte away at her wedding. So she was at a parsonage as well. So back to the account. John Robinson says, I returned with the message and then was told to get the parish clerk. I found him just beginning to light his kitchen fire, and I had to rush him off as I knew they would be at the church doors by the time we should get there. He seemed hard of belief. I said, come on, there's no time to waste. On the way, he said, I must stop to lace my boots. He did so, and just as the clock was going to strike 8, the 3 clergymen walked into what they called the front door of the old church, and Miss Bronte and Miss Nussey walked together in at the back door. As far as I remember, the only persons present at the ceremony were those I have named. Directly the ceremony was over, and the interested parties had gone to the parsonage, a carriage and pair drove up from Keighley. There was no station at Haworth then. I remember there was a bay horse and a grey one, and in a few moments Miss Bronte and Mr. Nicholls, now married, were away on their honeymoon. A message came to me to go to the parsonage for breakfast, and I went. So that's a simple and I think fascinating, moving account of the wedding of Charlotte Bronte from one of the people who was there. He missed out Margaret Wooler being there, but he got all the others. So there's John Robinson. There was a clerk who needed to be there who knew nothing about the wedding until it was fetched on the day. Charlotte and Arthur. Ellen. There was Reverend Grant and Reverend Sutcliffe. And, who else was there? Nobody else was there. Father Patrick Bronte wasn't there. So it was a very small affair. Even Martha Brown, John Brown's daughter, village servant, parsonage servant, a friend of Charlotte Bronte really. As far as we know, she wasn't there. And so a very small affair, very early in the morning, getting it out of the way, you could say, and then getting on with married life straight off on this bay horse and this grey horse. It's fascinating, isn't it? This is what we're talking about here, roughly 60 years, 59 years after the event, and by then this old man, John Robinson, remembers. He doesn't remember Margaret Wooler being there, which she was, giving Charlotte away. He remembers the 2 horses, the grey horse and the bay horse. So that was Charlotte and Arthur's wedding. They had a very happy wedding. It was all too brief, but we won't go into that side of it. But Charlotte really fell in love with her husband, and from then on she called herself Charlotte Bronte Nicholls. So a joyous day, early in the morning, not many people there, but the start of a wonderful event for Charlotte Bronte. She's the only Bronte sister to get married. Anne might have got married if she'd lived longer, who knows. Emily, I think, was always too insular, wouldn't have suited her. She was shy, but you never know. But I think Anne could well have, but Charlotte got married. At least she found, it was close to the end of her life, but she found that happiness and that love. And I think that's a brilliant story of triumph in the Bronte story. So thank you to John Robinson for telling us all about it in 1913. And thank you to you for listening to it here on the House of Bronte. I've got lots more Bronte stories, news, events coming up on this channel, so please do like it, please do subscribe, you can comment below, and please join me again for another House of Bronte episode. Thank you.